She forgets she's married here, he joked at the gala. I smiled. Later, he caught me advising the board chair. His blood ran cold. We're in trouble, he gasped to HR. The grand ballroom of the downtown Chicago hotel smelled like expensive perfume, roasted tenderloin, and the kind of forced corporate cheerfulness that always gave me a slight headache. I was standing near a massive ice sculpture that was slowly melting into a silver drip pan, holding a glass of ginger ale that everyone assumed was champagne. I prefer a clear head at these things. Actually, I prefer not to be at these things at all, but when you are the husband of a rising regional director, attendance is mandatory. You're a prop. A well-dressed accessory meant to nod, smile, and make your spouse look incredibly grounded. I was 45 years old, wearing a tailored charcoal suit that nobody noticed, perfectly content being the invisible man in the room. Across the sea of clinking glasses and forced laughter stood my wife, Stella. She was 39, wearing a stunning crimson dress that hugged her perfectly. She was radiant. She was always radiant when she had an audience. She was holding court with a group of her colleagues, her head thrown back in a full, uninhibited laugh. It was the exact same laugh she used to save for me on lazy Sunday mornings a long time ago before ambition hollowed out our marriage. Standing right beside her, far closer than any professional setting demanded, was Julian. Julian was 41, the kind of mid-level executive who wore too much cologne, talked too loudly about his golf handicap, and treated the junior staff like personal servants. He had that smug, overconfident aura of a man who thought he was the smartest person in any room, simply because no one had ever bothered to punch him in the mouth. He had his arm draped casually over the back of Stella's chair, his fingers brushing the fabric of her dress in a way that screamed ownership. I watched them from my quiet corner, completely unnoticed. It's amazing how invisible you become when people decide you don't matter. To Julian and the rest of the department, I was just Nolan, the guy who used to be a lawyer but now mostly stayed home, traded a few stocks, and baked sourdough bread. I was the harmless house cat. They had no idea who I used to be. The conversation in their circle grew louder as the wine flowed. I saw Julian lean in, his face flushed with alcohol and arrogance. He looked around his little circle of sycophants, then looked right at Stella, grinning like a shark. He raised his glass. His voice carried over the ambient noise of the ballroom, loud enough for at least 20 people around them to hear perfectly clearly. "I'm telling you guys," Julian announced, his voice dripping with sleazy confidence. "She might wear the ring, but she is mine from 9 to 5. Ask anyone. She practically forgets she's married when she steps into the office." The group erupted. It wasn't a polite chuckle. It was the kind of loud, enabling laughter that hits you like a physical blow. But the worst part wasn't the joke. The worst part was Stella. She didn't scold him. She didn't subtly step away. She leaned into him, her cheeks flushed, and laughed right along with the rest of them. She validated it. In front of her colleagues, in a room she knew I was standing in, she let another man claim ownership of her for a cheap laugh. If you are listening to this, you might be wondering why I didn't walk over there and break his jaw. Society tells us that a real man demands satisfaction. A real man throws his drink in the guy's face, grabs his wife by the arm, and causes a scene. But rage is sloppy. Rage is an emotional reaction that hands your power over to the person who insulted you. If I had yelled, Julian would have played the victim. He would have held up his hands, smirked, and told everyone I was an insecure, jealous husband who couldn't take a joke. Stella would have been mortified, and I would have been the villain of their little office soap opera. I didn't give them the satisfaction. I didn't break my glass. I didn't storm over. I just stood there, completely still, and analyzed the situation like a math problem. I watched the micro-expressions on the faces of the junior staff who were laughing, but looking deeply uncomfortable. I watched the way Julian's hand slipped a fraction of an inch lower on Stella's waist. I let the reality of what my marriage had become wash over me, completely and totally. I didn't feel rage. I felt a cold, absolute clarity. I smiled. It was a very small, very terrifying smile, meant for absolutely no one but myself. I gently set my ginger ale down on the nearest cocktail table, adjusted my cuffs, and turned toward the terrace doors. I needed some fresh air, not because I was upset, but because I had some serious planning to do. The Chicago night air was biting, a sharp contrast to the stuffy, cologne-soaked heat of the ballroom. I stepped out onto the wide stone balcony overlooking the city skyline, pulling the glass door shut behind me. The heavy glass instantly muted the jazz band and the chatter, wrapping me in a sudden, beautiful silence. I walked over to the edge, gripped the cold stone railing, and looked out at the grid of city lights stretching out into the dark. I took a long, deep breath. The cold air felt like ice water in my lungs, waking up parts of my brain that had been dormant for almost 5 years. I was done. There was no going back to couples counseling, no tearful conversations about our feelings, no pretending that Stella was just going through a phase. She had shown me exactly who she was, and more importantly, who she thought I was. She thought I was weak. She thought I was blind. While I was staring at the traffic far below, the balcony door opened and closed with a soft click. I didn't turn around, assuming it was a smoker looking for a secluded spot. Then I heard a very calm, very familiar voice. "You always did prefer the quiet corners, Nolan. Even back when you were tearing people apart in the boardroom." I turned my head. Standing a few feet away, wrapped in a heavy wool shawl over a stunning evening gown, was Diana. She was 60 years old, possessed a stare that could melt steel, and currently served as the chairwoman of the board for Stella's company. She was the keynote speaker for the evening, the untouchable royalty of the firm. Executives trembled when she walked into an elevator. I gave her a genuine smile, the first one of the night. "Hello, Diana. It's been a while." I see you're still making the mid-level manager sweat. She walked over and stood beside me at the railing, looking out at the city. "It keeps the blood pressure up. Builds character." She turned to look at me, her sharp eyes scanning my face. "What are you doing here, Nolan? And please don't tell me you're working in this circus." "I'm the +1," I replied simply. "My wife is Stella, Regional Director of Sales." Diana raised an eyebrow, genuinely surprised. "Stella is your wife? The one who just closed the West Coast expansion?" She paused, processing the information. I read her file. There is absolutely nothing in there that mentions she is married to one of the most ruthless corporate defense attorneys the Midwest has ever seen. "Former attorney," I corrected her gently. "And she prefers it if people think I just dabble in consulting. It makes her feel like the alpha in the room." Diana let out a dry, humorless chuckle. She knew exactly who I was. For years ago, before I walked away from the grind, I was senior counsel at a massive corporate firm. Diana had been facing a catastrophic, career-ending indictment from the Securities and Exchange Commission due to the shady practices of her former business partner. It was a mess that would have sent her to federal prison. I took her case. I spent 6 months meticulously burying the prosecution in so much counter-litigation, technical compliance data, and aggressive legal maneuvering that they quietly dropped the charges and settled for a minor fine. I saved her life, her fortune, and her legacy. "You don't strike me as a man who enjoys playing the docile house husband," Diana said softly, watching me closely. "You're too quiet tonight, Nolan. The last time you were this quiet, 2 federal prosecutors ended up resigning." "I'm just enjoying the view, Diana. It's a very educational evening." She didn't press the issue. She knew me too well. She knew that when I went silent, I was building a case. She reached into her clutch, pulled out a heavy, gold-embossed card, and slid it smoothly into the breast pocket of my suit jacket. "I'm expanding my personal advisory board next month," she said, her tone shifting to pure, cold business. "I need someone who understands the architecture of a massacre. Someone who can find the rot in a company and cut it out without making a mess. Call my private line next week. We have business to discuss." "I might be looking for a change of scenery very soon," I replied, tapping the pocket where the card sat. "I'll make that call." She nodded once, a gesture of absolute respect, and turned to head back inside. Just as she grabbed the handle of the glass door, I saw a movement in the shadows near the entrance. It was Julian. He had wandered out onto the balcony, a fresh drink in his hand, looking slightly flushed. He was probably coming out here to find me, maybe to offer me a patronizing pat on the back or drop another thinly veiled insult about how he spent more time with my wife than I did. I saw the arrogant smirk plastered across his face as he pushed the door open. But the smirk vanished the second he realized who I was standing with. Julian froze mid-step. The heavy glass door was half open, letting the muffled sounds of the gala spill out into the cold air. He stared at Diana. Every single employee in that company knew Diana. She was the executioner. She didn't mingle with the staff. She didn't make small talk at parties. She arrived, delivered her keynote, and left. To see her standing in the freezing cold, having an intimate, hushed conversation with the guy he had just been mocking to his friends, completely short-circuited Julian's alcohol-soaked brain. I watched his eyes dart from Diana to me, trying to process the data. It didn't compute. I was supposed to be the loser husband. The guy who baked bread. Diana noticed him standing there like a deer in the headlights. She didn't say a word to him. She just gave him a look of absolute, chilling indifference, the kind of look you give a stray dog rummaging through your trash. Then, she turned back to me, gave me one final, respectful nod that Julian could clearly see, and walked past him into the ballroom without uttering a single syllable. Julian was left standing there, the cold wind whipping his hair, holding a rapidly melting whiskey on the rocks. The blood had completely drained from his face. He looked at me. I didn't say anything. I didn't scowl. I didn't look angry. I just looked at him with the calm, dead eyes of a predator watching a rat walk into a trap. I reached into my pocket, pulled out the gold-embossed card Diana had just given me, and casually tapped it against my chin, pretending to read the lettering in the dim light. I saw his throat swallow hard. His confidence was gone, replaced by a sudden, primal panic. He realized in that split second that the ecosystem of the office he thought he ruled was actually a very small pond, and he had no idea what kind of monster was swimming in the deep water. He didn't say a word to me. He spun around, almost dropping his drink, and practically sprinted back inside the ballroom. I stayed out there for another minute, letting the cold air sharpen my focus, before I followed him in. I didn't go back to Stella. I stayed near the perimeter, watching the ripple effect of what had just happened. I spotted Julian near the bar. He had cornered his boss, a 52-year-old chief operating officer named Grant. Grant was a no-nonsense executive who cared strictly about profit margins and hated internal drama. Julian was leaning in close to Grant, his hands shaking slightly, gesturing frantically toward the balcony, then toward where Diana was now seated at the VIP table. Even from 50 feet away, I could read Julian's lips perfectly. He looked terrified. "We have a problem," Julian whispered frantically. Grant frowned, pulling his arm away from Julian's grasp. He looked annoyed. "What are you talking about? What do you mean we have a problem?" I didn't need to hear the rest. Julian was trying to explain that the harmless husband he had been antagonizing for the last 6 months was somehow connected to the highest level of corporate power in their universe. Julian was realizing that he had poked a bear, and now he was desperately trying to figure out if the bear had teeth. "Oh, Julian. You have no idea. The teeth are the least of your worries. It's the venom you need to be afraid of." I watched them argue for another second, then I turned and walked toward the coat check. I had seen enough for one night. The gala was over for me. The real work was about to begin. When I drove home that night, leaving Stella at the gala under the excuse of a sudden migraine, the silence in my car felt heavy with the weight of the past. To understand how I dismantled their lives so thoroughly, you have to understand who I used to be, and why I chose to become a ghost in my own marriage. For years ago, I wasn't baking sourdough or managing a modest stock portfolio. I was a senior partner at one of the most ruthless corporate defense firms in Chicago. My specialty wasn't trial law. It was corporate architecture and structural destruction. I was the guy multi-billion-dollar companies called when they had a toxic executive, an internal embezzlement ring, or a severe compliance failure. My job was to go into a massive corporation, find the rot, document it with absolute precision, and legally eradicate it so cleanly that the shareholders never even noticed a drop in stock price. I spent my days swimming in NDAs, non-compete clauses, and whistleblower protections. I didn't just understand corporate law, I wrote the rulebooks. But that life comes with a price. You don't spend 80 hours a week swimming in toxic waste without absorbing some of it. I was 41 years old, stressed out of my mind, living on black coffee and adrenaline. Then, one Tuesday afternoon during a marathon deposition, the left side of my body went completely numb, and I collapsed. It was a transient ischemic attack. A mini stroke. A warning shot from my own body telling me that if I didn't stop, I was going to die at my desk. That health scare changed everything. I realized the money and the power were useless if I wasn't alive to enjoy them. So, I stepped back. I cashed out my equity in the firm, which was substantial enough to ensure I never had to work another day in my life if I didn't want to. I transitioned into a silent, background role. Stella was supportive at first. We had been married for 5 years at that point. She was just starting her climb into middle management. I told her it was her time to shine. I took over the house, the cooking, the mundane daily tasks. I wanted to be the solid foundation she could build her career on. I wanted a quiet, peaceful life. But here is the dark truth about corporate climbers with narcissistic tendencies. They don't respect sacrifice, they only respect power. As Stella moved up the ladder, her perception of me changed. Because I was no longer wearing a bespoke suit and destroying lives in a boardroom, she started to view me as a subordinate. The man who used to terrify federal regulators became the guy who forgot to pick up the dry cleaning. She started introducing me at parties simply as Nolan, dropping any mention of my legal background because it didn't serve her narrative of being the sole powerhouse in the relationship. She wanted the spotlight entirely on her, and I willingly gave it to her. I thought my silence was an act of love. She interpreted my silence as weakness. That was her fatal miscalculation. She assumed that just because a weapon is kept in its sheath, it has forgotten how to cut. She forgot that you don't survive a decade in corporate litigation without developing a profound, almost supernatural ability to spot a lie. I didn't lose my edge, I just stopped using it on strangers. But when you live with a corporate assassin, you should really be careful about the evidence you leave lying around the house. The realization that my wife was sleeping with Julian didn't hit me all at once like a lightning bolt. It was a slow, agonizing crawl of accumulating data. It started 4 months ago, during the summer, when Stella insisted on hosting a backyard barbecue for her department at our home in Evanston. She pitched it as a team-building exercise. Looking back, it was a power play. She wanted to show off the beautiful suburban house that my old money had bought, while pretending she was the sole provider. I played my part. I marinated the chicken, set up the patio furniture, and made sure the cooler was stocked with imported beer. Julian arrived late, making a grand entrance. He strutted into my backyard wearing designer sunglasses and loafers without socks, acting less like a guest and more like a landlord inspecting the property. He immediately gravitated towards Stella. I was standing by the grill, flipping burgers, wearing an apron. I watched them interact. It wasn't what they said, it was the proximity. Human beings have a natural bubble of personal space. When a colleague enters that bubble, there is usually a subtle, instinctive step back. Stella didn't step back. When Julian leaned in to talk to her over the music, he invaded her space completely, and she leaned into him. But the real insult came an hour later. I was wiping down the prep table when Julian strolled over. He didn't say hello. He didn't thank me for hosting. He just leaned against the railing, looked at me, and snapped his fingers lightly. "Hey, Nolan, right?" he said, using that tone reserved for waiters. "Be a good guy and fetch me another beer from the kitchen. The cooler out here is mostly ice." He didn't ask. He commanded. And as he said it, he looked over his shoulder at Stella, who was sitting at the patio table. He locked eyes with her, a clear display of dominance. "Look how I can treat your husband in his own home." I felt a dangerous, familiar spark ignite in the back of my brain. The old Nolan, the ruthless lawyer, screamed at me to grab him by his expensive polo shirt and throw him over the fence. But I suppressed it. I took a deep breath, pasted on a pleasant, clueless smile, and nodded. "Sure thing, Julian. Coming right up." I walked into the kitchen, grabbed a beer, and took a full 60 seconds to compose myself. When I walked back out, I handed it to him. He didn't say thank you. He just walked back to the table and sat down right next to Stella. That was when I started gathering intelligence. I didn't say a word, I just watched. I noticed that they were both wearing identical, custom-woven Apple Watch bands. A small detail, but cheaters love little secret symbols of their connection. Later, when they were sitting across from each other at the patio table, I dropped a napkin and bent down to pick it up. Underneath the table, hidden from the rest of the party, Julian's knee was pressed firmly against the inside of Stella's thigh. She wasn't pulling away. I stood up, threw the napkin in the trash, and went back to the grill. I didn't confront them. Confrontation gives the enemy a chance to build a defense, to delete messages, to gaslight you. Instead, I let them think they were the smartest people in the world. I played the docile, oblivious host for the rest of the evening. But the husband was dead. The corporate assassin had just woken up from a 4-year hibernation, and he was hungry. The barbecue was the catalyst, but the absolute confirmation came a month ago. Once a corporate auditor suspects fraud, they don't just look at the big numbers, they look at the discrepancies in the daily routine. The tiny, boring details that people forget to cover up. It was a Tuesday night. Stella had called me at 6 in the evening, sounding stressed and exhausted. She claimed she was trapped in an emergency quarterly review with the executive team. She apologized profusely, said she would be home by 9, and told me not to wait up for dinner. "Don't worry about it, honey," I had said, my voice dripping with manufactured empathy. "I'll save you some of the mushroom risotto." Knock them dead. I hung up the phone and walked over to my laptop sitting on the kitchen island. A few years ago, when Stella upgraded her phone, she had been annoyed by the family tracking app we used for safety. She thought she deleted it, but she had only removed the widget from her home screen. The permissions were still active. I opened the locator on my laptop. I wasn't expecting her to be at the office. Cheaters always use work as the ultimate alibi because questioning it makes you look unsupportive. I watched the little red dot that represented my wife's phone pulse on the digital map. It wasn't anywhere near the corporate plaza in the financial district. The dot was stationary, parked solidly at the address of a high-end, discreet boutique hotel located in the West Loop. It was the kind of place that charged $500 a night and prided itself on private underground parking. I sat alone at my kitchen island, eating cold mushroom risotto straight out of the pan, and watched that little red dot. It didn't move for 3 hours. I didn't cry. I didn't throw my plate against the wall. The overwhelming emotion wasn't grief, it was a cold, clinical disappointment. She was so sloppy. If you are going to destroy a marriage, at least have the intelligence to turn off your location services. It was insulting to my intelligence. When she finally walked through the front door at 9:30, looking slightly flushed and smelling faintly of a soap we didn't own, I was sitting on the couch reading a book. "God, what a nightmare," she sighed, kicking off her heels and dropping her laptop bag heavily onto the floor. Grant kept us in there debating Q3 projections for hours. "I am exhausted." She walked over and kissed me on the top of the head. I didn't flinch. I just turned the page of my book. "I'm sorry, that sounds rough," I said smoothly. "Did you get it sorted out?" "Mostly," she lied, heading toward the stairs. "I'm just going to take a quick shower and crash. Did you have a good night?" "It was very quiet," I replied. "Very educational." I listened to the shower run upstairs, the sound echoing through the empty house. It was in that exact moment, sitting on the couch listening to the water hit the tiles, that I decided I wasn't just going to divorce her. A divorce is a negotiation. A divorce implies a division of assets and a mutual parting of ways. I didn't want a divorce. I wanted a demolition. She loved her career more than anything else in the world. She used her corporate status to justify her arrogance, her infidelity, and her disrespect for me. She and Julian had built their little fantasy world inside the walls of that company, using company time and company money to fund their affair. So, I decided to use the company to burn them to the ground. I was going to turn the very system they worshipped into a nightmare they could never wake up from. And the best part was, they had absolutely no idea the guillotine was already being built. If you are enjoying this story of corporate revenge so far, please take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Also, leave a comment down below telling me what city you are watching from. Every single interaction helps this video reach more people who need to hear it. Thank you so much. Now, let's get back to the destruction. Every corporate hierarchy has a bottom layer that most executives choose to ignore. Below the regional directors like Stella and the arrogant middle managers like Julian, there is a foundation built entirely on the backs of junior staff. These are the people who handle the shredding, the coffee runs, and the mind-numbing data entry for expense reports. They are essentially invisible to people like Julian, who view them as little more than office furniture with a pulse. That was Julian's second fatal mistake. He forgot that the people who process your paperwork are the ones who see the truth behind your lies. Her name was Maya. She was 24 years old, a junior operations assistant who had graduated from college with high hopes, only to find herself trapped in a cycle of verbal abuse and menial tasks. I met her exactly 2 months before the gala. It was a miserable, pouring rainstorm on a Tuesday afternoon. Stella had texted me in a panic, claiming she had left a crucial folder containing physical vendor contracts on the kitchen counter and needed them for a 3 o'clock meeting with a major client. Being the supportive husband I was playing at the time, I drove 45 minutes through the snarling Chicago traffic to deliver it. When I walked into the soaring glass and steel lobby of their building, I didn't see my wife. Instead, I saw Maya sitting on a cold marble bench near the elevators, crying quietly into a crumpled tissue. She looked incredibly young, fragile, and entirely defeated. I watched for a moment as people in expensive suits hurried past her, not one of them pausing to check if she was okay. I walked over, sat down on the opposite end of the bench, and offered her an unopened bottle of water from my briefcase. She jumped, startled, and tried to wipe her eyes quickly. She started stammering an apology, something about seasonal allergies or being overwhelmed by the rain. I looked her in the eye and told her that I used to be a lawyer, and I knew exactly what seasonal allergies looked like. They didn't cause that specific kind of hollow, exhausted stare. Slowly, the story came out. Julian had spent the last half hour screaming at her in the middle of the open plan office. Her crime? She had booked his flight to a conference in Denver in premium economy instead of first class because she was following the company's mandatory travel budget policy to the letter. Julian had thrown the printed itinerary at her, called her a brainless little clerk in front of the entire department, and threatened to make sure she never worked in this city again. I asked her where Stella was during this outburst. Maya looked down at her shaking hands and whispered that Stella had been standing right there, leaning against the doorframe of Julian's office, checking her nails. Stella hadn't said a word to stop him. In fact, Maya said she saw a small, amused smile on Stella's face. I felt a cold, sharp knot of anger form in my chest. The disrespect Stella showed me was one thing, but enabling the abuse of a defenseless junior employee just to stroke her lover's ego was a different level of depravity. I leaned in and spoke to Maya very quietly. I didn't give her empty sympathy. I gave her a weapon. Corporate bullies are lazy, Maya, I told her, my voice low and steady. They think they're untouchable, so they stop being careful. You don't fight a guy like Julian with tears. You fight him with a paper trail. Document every insult. Save every aggressive email. And most importantly, keep an eye on his expenses. I didn't realize it then, but that 10-minute conversation in the lobby had just recruited the most valuable ally I could have asked for. I gave her my personal email address, told her to reach out if things got worse, and walked away. I had planted a seed in the one place Julian and Stella never thought to look, at the very bottom of their empire. The package arrived 2 weeks after that rainy afternoon. It wasn't a physical folder or a letter. It was a plain, unmarked manila envelope containing a single, silver USB flash drive. There was no return address. I took it into my home office, locked the door, and used an old laptop that had no connection to our home Wi-Fi. I wasn't taking any chances. When the drive mounted, I realized that Maya had done much more than just document insults. She had opened the gates to the digital graveyard of Julian and Stella's arrogance. The drive was packed with hundreds of files, scanned receipts, internal Slack logs, Uber trip histories, and unredacted travel folios. Maya had been the one processing Julian's expense reports for months, and she had started flagging the discrepancies the moment I gave her the idea. I spent the next 3 nights sitting in the dark, my face illuminated by the cold blue light of the screen, mapping out the architecture of their betrayal. It was a staggering display of entitlement. They weren't just having an affair, they were treating the company treasury like their personal vacation fund. The most damning evidence was the client development logs. I found a receipt for a dinner at an ultra-exclusive steakhouse in downtown Chicago. The bill was $740, including 2 bottles of wine that cost $200 each. Julian had listed the guest as a representative from a logistics firm in Seattle. I did a quick cross-reference check on the company's public calendar. That representative hadn't been in Chicago that weekend. He had been at a trade show in Las Vegas. Then there were the conference accommodations. Maya had pulled the deep-level data from the hotel booking system. For a regional summit in Miami, Julian and Stella had both booked individual rooms on the company card. Very professional on the surface. But the internal hotel logs showed that Stella's room key was used exactly twice, once to check in and once to check out. Julian's room, however, showed a constant stream of activity. Room service for 2 every morning. Late-night orders of champagne and chocolate-covered strawberries. They were so convinced of their own brilliance that they didn't even bother to hide the patterns. They were using company time and thousands of dollars of company money to fund their trysts in luxury hotels. But as I scrolled through the folders, I found the real nail in the coffin. It wasn't Julian's greed, it was Stella's complicity. As a regional director, Stella was the final approver for Julian's departmental budget. Every single one of those fraudulent receipts, every fake client dinner, and every luxury hotel upgrade had been digitally signed and authorized by her. She wasn't just a participant in the affair. She was the one providing the cover. She was using her corporate authority to bankroll her lover's lifestyle at the expense of the shareholders. In the eyes of the law, that wasn't just an affair, it was corporate embezzlement and a massive breach of fiduciary duty. I felt a strange, detached sense of pride as I organized the data into folders on my desktop. I felt like an archaeologist uncovering the ruins of a lost civilization, except this civilization was still standing, completely unaware that I was about to pull the rug out from under it. I began printing everything, organizing the physical copies into a navy blue binder. I labeled the tabs with the cold, clinical precision of the senior counsel I used to be. I was no longer a husband looking for proof of infidelity. I was a prosecutor preparing a death penalty case. To understand why this binder was so dangerous, you have to understand the specific rules of the game Stella and Julian were playing. Most large corporations have vague ethics policies that are rarely enforced unless something catastrophic happens. But Stella's company was different. And they were different because of me. 3 years ago, the firm had been rocked by a minor scandal involving a vice president and a vendor kickback scheme. To save the company's reputation, the board of directors demanded a total overhaul of their internal compliance and ethics code. Stella, who was desperate to climb the ladder and be seen as a leader in corporate governance, volunteered her department to be the test case for the new rules. I remember the night she brought the draft home. She was frustrated, complaining that the legal department had produced a document so thick and full of legalese that no one would ever read it. She threw the binder on the kitchen island and asked me to take a look at it. "Make it sound professional but ironclad, Nolan," she had said, pouring herself a glass of Chardonnay. "I want the board to see that my department is the gold standard for ethics." I spent the next 48 hours rewriting that code. My legal brain couldn't help itself. I took their weak, porous policies and turned them into a series of inescapable traps. I didn't do it out of malice back then. I did it because I was a perfectionist. I wrote Section 9, titled Inappropriate Hierarchical Relationships. It didn't just discourage affairs, it made them a terminal offense if they weren't disclosed to HR within 72 hours of the first romantic interaction. It was designed to prevent exactly what Stella and Julian were doing, a superior protecting a subordinate. I wrote Section 10, the Zero Tolerance Fiduciary Clause. This was my masterpiece. It stated that any employee who knowingly approved a fraudulent expense report was just as guilty as the person who submitted it. It defined corporate theft not just as stealing money, but as the misappropriation of company resources for personal gain or the facilitation of undisclosed personal relationships. I handed the final draft to Stella. She didn't even read the specifics. She just saw the clean formatting and the authoritative tone and was thrilled. She submitted it to the legal team as her own work. They were so impressed that they adopted my language word for word and rolled it out company-wide. Stella received a massive bonus and a promotion for spearheading the ethical revolution of the firm. And now, as I sat in my office 3 years later, I was looking at the signatures of Stella and Julian on the mandatory acknowledgement forms for that very code. They had both signed a legal document stating they understood that violating these rules would result in immediate termination without severance. The irony was so thick it was almost poetic. They were currently drowning in a pool that I had filled with water at Stella's own request. They had spent months laughing at me, thinking I was just a boring, retired guy who didn't understand the high-stakes world they lived in. They had no idea that I was the one who had built the very walls that were about to close in on them. I closed the navy binder and felt a calm, chilling sense of finality. The trap was set. All I had to do was wait for the right moment to spring it. The weekend following the gala was perhaps the most difficult acting performance of my life. If you want to truly destroy someone who thinks they are superior to you, you must maintain the status quo until the very last second. You cannot give them a single reason to suspect that the wind has changed direction. On Saturday morning, I woke up early and made a full breakfast, eggs, bacon, and fresh coffee. Stella came down at 10, looking slightly hungover but still carrying that smug glow from the party. She talked incessantly about how impressed the board had been with her regional reports. She didn't mention Julian by name, but she kept referring to the team's incredible chemistry. "You were a bit of a wallflower last night, Nolan," she said, smearing jam on her toast. "But I suppose that's just your speed these days, isn't it?" Quiet and in the background. I didn't flinch. I just smiled and told her that I was perfectly happy being her support system. I played the role of the devoted, slightly dull husband to perfection. I even spent the afternoon working in the garden, planting the new shrubs she had asked for, while she sat on the patio answering emails, which I knew meant texting Julian. But while my hands were in the dirt, my mind was in the Delaware court system. When a corporate scandal of this magnitude breaks, the legal fallout is like a grenade in a small room. The company wouldn't just fire Stella, they would likely sue her for the $30,000 she had helped Julian embezzle. And in our state, the law views marital assets as a single pool of water. If they sued her, they could come after my savings, my investments, and my house. I wasn't going to let Stella's infidelity cost me a single cent of the fortune I had spent 15 years building. Over the last month, I had been working with a specialized boutique firm in Delaware. Using a series of perfectly legal but highly complex maneuvers, I had moved the vast majority of my liquid assets into an irrevocable blind trust. I had also drafted a unilateral divorce petition, citing irreconcilable differences and a separate property settlement agreement. The most important piece was the house. I had bought our Evanston home with my own money before we were even married, but I had put her name on the title as a gesture of love. That was a mistake I was now correcting. I had drafted a quitclaim deed and a series of documents that essentially bought out her interest in the home using a small portion of our shared checking account, money that was already hers anyway. By Sunday night, on paper, I was a man of very modest means. My real wealth was safely tucked away behind a wall of Delaware law that even the best corporate attorneys would struggle to climb. I was legally amputating her from my life before the infection could spread to my bank account. Sunday night was the point of no return. Stella had told me she was going to a late-night strategy session with her department to prepare for a Monday morning briefing. I knew exactly what that meant. I checked the tracker on her car. She was at Julian's condo in Lincoln Park. I sat in my office, the navy binder open on my desk. I had digitized everything into a single, high-resolution PDF file. I didn't send it from my home computer. I didn't want any digital breadcrumbs leading back to our IP address. Instead, I used a secure, encrypted laptop and drove to a 24-hour coffee shop 3 towns over. I didn't send the file to human resources. HR is designed to protect the company, which often means protecting the managers to avoid a scandal. No, I went higher. I sent the email directly to Grant, the chief operating officer, and copied Diana, the chairwoman of the board. I knew their private executive email addresses because I had helped set up their security protocols years ago when I was their outside counsel. The subject line of the email was simple: emergency audit disclosure, fiduciary fraud and ethics violations, regional sales division. I didn't include a long, rambling letter about my hurt feelings. I didn't mention the affair in emotional terms. I wrote a 2-paragraph summary using the same cold, analytical tone I used when I was a senior counsel. I pointed out the $30,000 discrepancy. I cited sections 9 and 10 of the ethics code. I attached the binder. I hit send at exactly 11:45 p.m. I watched the progress bar crawl across the screen. When it hit 100%, I felt a strange, profound sense of peace. I drove home in the quiet Chicago night, listening to the hum of the tires on the asphalt. When I got back, the house was dark. Stella wasn't home yet. I went upstairs, brushed my teeth, and got into bed. I fell asleep almost instantly. It was the best sleep I had had in months. I knew that when the sun came up, the world Stella and Julian had built would begin to crumble, and there was absolutely nothing they could do to stop it. The guillotine was positioned, the blade was sharpened, and I had just pulled the cord. Monday morning arrived with a deceptive calm. I woke up at my usual time, made a pot of coffee, and sat by the window. Stella had come home late, around 2 in the morning, and was still upstairs sleeping. She had no idea that her professional life was already over. I received a text from Maya at 8:45 a.m. It was just one word: beginning. I could picture the scene perfectly. At the corporate headquarters, the executive floor would be in a state of controlled panic. Grant, the COO, was not a man who tolerated being blindsided. To receive a dossier of that magnitude on a Sunday night would have sent him into a cold rage. At 9:15, Julian arrived at the office. He usually spent the first 20 minutes of his day getting coffee and flirting with the receptionists. But today, as he stepped up to the security turnstile, his keycard didn't work. He tried it 3 times, getting more annoyed with each red flash. Before he could start complaining, 2 men from corporate security, not the friendly ones from the lobby, but the ones who handle high-level asset protection, approached him. They didn't say a word. They simply took his briefcase, took his company phone, and escorted him into a small, windowless interview room on the 4th floor. Grant was waiting for him. There was no HR representative. There were no lawyers. Just Grant and the navy binder. Julian, ever the arrogant narcissist, tried to play it off. He asked if there was a problem with his security clearance or if this was some kind of surprise performance review. Grant didn't even look up from the paperwork. He just opened the binder to the section containing the Marriott receipts and pushed it across the table. He then read Section 10 of the Ethics Code aloud, the section I had written about fiduciary theft and personal liability. Julian's face went from flushed with irritation to a sickly, grayish white. He tried to claim it was an administrative error. He tried to say he had misplaced the actual client receipts. But Grant wasn't listening. He informed Julian that he was being terminated for cause, effective immediately. But it didn't stop there. Grant told him that the company would be filing a civil suit for the recovery of the $30,000, and if Julian didn't sign a full confession and a waiver of all his stock options, they would be turning the dossier over to the state's attorney for a criminal embezzlement investigation. Julian, the man who had bragged about owning my wife just 48 hours ago, collapsed. He started sobbing, pleading for his career, offering to pay the money back twice over. Grant just stood up, signaled to the security guards, and walked out. Julian was escorted out of the building through the loading dock, carrying his belongings in a trash bag. His work husband fantasy had ended in the most humiliating way possible. Stella woke up at 9:30, complaining about a weird vibe she was getting from her work emails. She noticed that she couldn't access the internal server from her laptop. "I think the VPN is down again," she grumbled, tossing her hair. "This IT department is useless." I just nodded and told her I was sure it would be fixed by the time she got to the office. I watched her drive away in her BMW, looking every bit the high-powered executive she thought she was. It was the last time she would ever drive that car as an employee of that firm. When she walked into the lobby, she noticed the silence. People who usually greeted her with a "good morning, director" suddenly found themselves very busy looking at their shoes or their phones. She felt the shift in the atmosphere immediately. She was intercepted at the elevator by Grant's personal assistant. She was told that the COO and the chairwoman were waiting for her in the executive boardroom. Stella walked into that room with her chin held high, her power move blazer perfectly pressed. She assumed Julian had gotten into some minor trouble and that they needed her to clean it up. She was already rehearsing how she would distance herself from him while appearing to be a concerned leader. But when she saw Diana sitting at the head of the table, her heart dropped. Diana didn't do minor trouble. Grant didn't offer her a seat. He simply turned his laptop around and showed her the digital signature log. It showed every single time she had authorized Julian's fraudulent expenses over the last 8 months. "Explain these approvals, Stella," Grant said, his voice like a sheet of ice. Stella tried her usual tactics. She tried to play the busy executive card. She said she trusted her team and that she must have overlooked the details in the high volume of paperwork. Diana cut her off. "We've seen the GPS logs, Stella. We know that while you were overlooking these details, you were physically present in the hotel rooms being paid for by these fraudulent funds." Stella's world shattered. She tried to lie, tried to claim she was there for mentoring sessions, but the Marriott room service receipts for 2 breakfasts and champagne made that lie impossible. She realized then that they weren't just guessing. They had the receipts. They had the timeline. They had everything. She began to plead. She talked about her years of service, her expansion projects, her loyalty to the brand. "Loyalty?" Diana asked, her voice quiet and devastating. "You used your authority to embezzle $30,000 from this firm to fund an affair with a subordinate. You violated every single line of the ethics code that you claimed to have spearheaded. You didn't just break the rules, Stella. You turned this company into a punchline." Grant informed her that she was being placed on administrative leave without pay, effective immediately, pending a full forensic audit. Her devices were seized. She was told that if the audit found even $1 more of misappropriated funds, they would pursue criminal charges. But the final blow came when Stella asked how this happened. How did they find out? "The report was compiled by an external expert," Grant said, looking at her with pure disgust. "A legal consultant who knows our bylaws better than our own attorneys. A man named David Ellison." Stella stopped breathing. She knew that name. She had seen it on old legal documents in my office years ago. She had seen it on the very ethics code she was standing in front of. She realized in that moment that the man she had called a houseplant had been the one who had orchestrated her execution. She was escorted out of the building in a state of total shock, her career, her pride, and her future reduced to ash in under an hour. I was waiting for her when she got home. I was sitting in the large leather armchair by the fireplace, the same chair where I had sat for years playing the role of the quiet, supportive husband. The house was silent, except for the ticking of the clock on the mantel. By the front door, my suitcases were packed and ready. Stella didn't just walk in, she collapsed through the door. She looked like a different person. Her hair was disheveled, her makeup was smeared with tears, and she was shaking so hard she could barely stand. She saw me, And for a moment, I saw a flicker of the old Stella, the one who thought she could manipulate her way out of anything. You, she rasped, her voice breaking. You did this. You destroyed everything. Why? Why would you go this far? I took a slow sip of my scotch and looked at her. I didn't feel anger. I didn't feel joy. I felt a profound sense of completion. I didn't destroy your life, Stella, I said, my voice calm and steady. You and Julian destroyed it. I just provided the documentation. You thought my silence was weakness. You thought, because I stopped being a ruthless lawyer in public, I had forgotten how to protect myself. That was your mistake. She started screaming then. She called me a monster, a coward, a snake. She screamed that I had ruined her career, that Julian wouldn't even talk to her, and that she was going to be bankrupt. She demanded to know how I could be so cruel to the woman I supposedly loved. I stood up and walked over to the kitchen island. I picked up the navy binder and the manila envelope containing the divorce papers and the quitclaim deed. I set them down in front of her. Love requires respect, Stella, I said. You stopped respecting me the moment you realized I wouldn't fight back against your little insults. You let another man mock me in public while you laughed. You used my money and my house to provide yourself a comfortable life, while you cheated on me with a man who couldn't even afford his own dinner. You didn't want a husband. You wanted a safety net. I leaned in closer, my voice dropping to a whisper. The safety net is gone. The house is in a trust you have no access to. My assets are protected. You have 30 days to find a new place to live before the eviction process begins. She looked at me, her eyes wide with a terror I had only seen in the eyes of the corporate criminals I used to prosecute. She realized that she had no leverage, no power, no allies. Where are you going? She whispered, her voice trembling. I have a flight to Seattle in 2 hours, I replied, grabbing my coat. Diana has offered me a senior strategic advisory role at her parent firm. It pays significantly more than your old job did, and the best part is, I'll be working with people who actually understand the value of loyalty. I picked up my suitcases and walked toward the door. I didn't look back. I didn't need a final jab or a dramatic exit. I had won the only way that mattered, by being the only person in the room who knew exactly what was happening. As the town car pulled away from the house, I looked out the window at the quiet, suburban street. I felt lighter than I had in years. The nightmare was over for me. For Stella and Julian, it was just beginning. Did I take it too far by weaponizing the very system she worked for to destroy her entire career along with our marriage, or did she and her work husband get exactly the corporate nightmare they deserved? Let me know your verdict in the comments. Thank you so much for watching. If you haven't subscribed yet, take a second to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Also, please leave a comment telling me what city you are watching from. Every single interaction helps this video reach more people who need to hear it. Thank you so much, and I will see you in the next one.